like this comment. Spark a little debate.
Well, it's Good afternoon. We'll get started. Welcome everybody, thank you for joining us. My name is Melissa Dodd and I'm the Chief Information Officer for the Boston Public Schools. We're going to get started with a couple of questions. Our focus is on targeting underserved populations of students. And with that, I think I can come at that from many different perspectives. We're going to have a slice here that looks at the use of data and assessments in terms of improving student learning outcomes, but we'll see where that takes us. I'm going to kick things off with a question and now ask our panelists here to introduce themselves as they provide their perspective. So as we look at how data and assessment are being used to accelerate student performance, in your own areas of work, what do you see as some of the most promising practices, whether that be from teachers or school leaders? And then have you seen any obstacles that schools or teachers are facing in adopting these?
Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Christina Buenafe. I teach high school math in Boston Public Schools, so that's what my perspective will be in relation to these questions. I find that now there's a lot more data available to us through like big data aggregators and systems, but the major obstacle is getting that stuff to teachers and students and administrators in a timely manner, because we're noticing that there's such a lag between when things appear and then when they finally get filtered down to the most reluctant adopters. Like there's no consistent culture around usage of data to improve instruction. So for instance, Boston Public Schools has this assessment technology incorporated ATI system that tracks predictive assessments and MCAS scores and other things, and they have functions in there to create intervention alerts to help like low-performing students. But I checked to see how many teachers at my school had logged in, and there's a grand total of 4. So it's not making it to the users, then that's such a huge obstacle.
Could you restate the question?
Sure. So curious to think for you to share what you've seen in terms of some promising practices, so how data is being used to support students, and then also to offer up any obstacles that you see.
Sure. So my name is John Warner, and I'm from Citizen Schools, and I helped write the concept paper back in 1995. And back then, we noticed middle schoolers in Boston were getting out of school at 1:30. And were not reaching their potential during the out-of-school time. So we said we'll add a few more hours to school's time, 3 more hours on top of the 6 hours kids go to school. And in the 18 years since we started, it's really fascinating to see how schools have gotten much more savvy at using data and really making smart decisions. I think as our program has evolved and we're practitioners, we've used data to kind of reinforce some of our bets we've made. We believe expanding learning time can make a difference. We believe democratizing teaching, bringing in a second shift of educator, non-traditional teachers to complement what the students are learning by day can help. And we've seen a lot of schools, and we've grown from just being in Boston to being 8 U.S. states. We've seen schools really double down on math and language arts and try to help inner city middle school kids really succeed. But we're noticing that just because kids are doing better in math doesn't mean they're making a strong transition to high school and have college and career success aligned. And so we're trying to make the learning relevant. So it's not enough just to help test scores go up. And I think some best practices are building strong relationships between mentors or people to kind of reinforce the learning. And there's a center here at MIT called the Edgerton Center that showed that a lot of inner city kids who are doing well in math weren't necessarily going into STEM fields. And part of that is because they don't necessarily know folks that are in those fields. And so best practice is not just to help kids do well in math, but make it applicable and have them have success. And I think schools aren't looking at data about the culture of the school. That you could be so focused on how we're going to look in the local paper in terms of our math scores and totally miss a lot of indicators that can help. I don't know if that totally answered the question, but I felt like I gave enough to kind of start this off.
That's great.
Afternoon, everybody. I'm John Maycock. I founded the Achievement Network. Just some context before I answer the question, just about how I come at the answer. We're a nonprofit. We're essentially focused on how do you actually get the right data in the hands of the teachers and school leaders and district leaders to change instruction to really drive student achievement in schools. And our organization thinks about it, part from technology and part from the right tool, but really the change management process of, and what you articulated earlier is like, how do you actually help people figure out how to use the data? Not just give more data in their hands. So we support Boston Public Schools, and then we're in 8 geographies across the country. So what's working is, I'll give a couple. In terms of teachers, when you can use data exceptionally well, now we have the ability to be able to highlight specific student needs and be able to target intervention to catch students up. I mean, in urban education, most of the students that we're supporting are 2, 3, 4 grade levels behind. So you have a monumental task as a teacher. So if you can get data in their hands of the teacher and specifically understand what students know and don't know, then you're much more likely to be able to catch them up. So that's number one, and we've seen some very promising practices in multiple schools and districts across the country there. I think that's a huge opportunity. The second I would say is, in schools, it can be, if you're in school yourself or managing your school, it can be a lonely place. Like, you are so focused on how do you make change in your building. And data has such potential to be able to highlight what works in different schools and then be able to accelerate change by sharing those practices across schools. So for instance, like right here in Boston, Orchard Gardens is a turnaround school. They've been able to use data exceptionally well over the last couple of years and have some of the greatest student achievement gains in the entire state of Massachusetts. What they've done in Orchard Gardens can be done in other schools in Boston, but it's just getting the insights from that school into the hands of others. So that's like another huge potential. And then in obstacles, Melissa, I mean, yeah, there's a number, but I mean, I'll give you just a few. I'll give you 3. One is time. So often we layer on more and more assessment or data on schools, but we don't carve out the time in the schedule for teachers and leaders to be able to use that information effectively. If you carve out the time, you can make dramatic gains. So a quick story is in the District of Columbia 2 years ago, they actually created full professional development days that line up with the assessments that they're providing to students. And that way they're giving a full day of PD for teachers to be able to take that data and use it effectively. And that has dramatic change, and that's a 120 school district. If you can do it there, you can do it in other places. The other one is, what we just heard at the lunchtime is, it's around management. So what I've seen is like an obstacle of, it doesn't fit within the management routines of how you run your building. So like there's more data, but people aren't circling back to it and to say, like, what does this mean? How do we use it, utilize it effectively? There's no routine created. And so then again, you're just layering on more and more information that people can't digest. And then I guess the last I'd say is at the teacher level. If you don't connect the data to how it actually can make the teacher's life easier, then people won't adopt the use. So you really have to personalize and understand the perspective of the people in the classroom.
So I think, thank you very much. In your responses, I'm hearing a theme, and Christina and John, you mentioned both around culture, whether it's culture around data use, culture of the school, structures that are in place at a school that make this more easier or more challenging. So how do you think that for schools that have really, either that have embraced data or the struggling, the slow adopters, if you will, what have you seen in terms of a shift in thinking or understanding about student learning and capacity for learning among students? So have you seen that in the schools that you're in or have worked in?
Well, I'll speak from the struggling to adopt data, for trying to get into the early adopters kind of competent stage. But when there's this initial stage of worry and freaking out once test scores come in, we're a new international baccalaureate school as well, and when we got those test scores back, some subject teachers started freaking out about how that was going to impact how they would be evaluated. So then it just adds this another whole dimension to looking at the data, but not using it to advance the learning, trying to get more away from freaking out, but to just using it and say, oh, okay, let's look at how they did on these questions. What can I change in my instruction? How can I reteach this unit so that they remember how to address population growth with a proper logistic S-curve instead of drawing a picture of a house on the exam. And other things with getting too mired in details, maybe a negative. We don't have anything like Kickboard now, but I can see if people go from no data use to too much and getting obsessed with it, then they would, again, get paranoid about whether they're being judged by headmasters or other administrators on whether their students were learning. And I think that a good shift is being able to say, okay, to disconnect from that and say, okay, my kids did badly on this scale, I'm going to change my lessons to adapt to that.
So, Debola, your question asks about culture and how data can be. So I think trillions of dollars have been spent on education reform, and not a lot of that has gone to empowering the student or the parent and guardian. And I think data can be used to help a student have confidence in themselves. And there's one student I'm thinking in particular, both brothers dropped out of high school, one brother community college, and she had no reason to believe that she could succeed. And as a student who would go a week at a time, not talking to anyone. It was her own personal video game. And I remember we were able to work with her and help her have confidence in herself and take risks and work in teams and feel successful. She went on to college, was salutatorian of a high school, and now is a Boston Public School math teacher, teaching not too far from where she grew up in Dorchester. So I think you can use data to help build confidence and faith in the student and getting and involving the family. A lot of families we've worked with in inner cities, the parents went to the schools that we're in and they don't trust the data, and they had negative experiences there, or they're first generation immigrants and they just don't understand the system. So using data not as a way to kind of push the family and student and ostracize them and marginalize them, but as a way to have a conversation. That's a skill set that I think school districts, some that are doing it well are able to develop. I mean, too many inner city teachers, and that's the place I'm in, I think almost blame the family or the circumstance and don't see how to use the family or the situation where these kids are growing up as assets, and data can be used in that way. Then, charter schools got started in the 90s, right around the time my nonprofit got started, and I think charter schools don't represent much more than 2% of public education. You probably know. Yeah. And I think a third of them are high performing and are proving all kids can learn and are real inspiration. But I think 2/3 are not much better than district schools. And my wife and I were both on boards of 2 charter schools. Hers got closed. Mine is really thriving. I don't think it had anything to do with family. But I think people just think because it has something being implemented, like what a charter school is, it's going to succeed. Expanded learning time can be implemented well and not well, and you need to use data to assess it and build coalitions and set goals and have a clear vision. So what I'm saying there about culture is that there's a lot of other factors other than just how the numbers are, but what you do with it. as a nonprofit that partners with schools, I mean, there's so many schools and school districts that have a graveyard of nonprofits that have tried to work with them. And I think it's getting a lot better than it was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But I think for a nonprofit, if some of you are starting them or trying to go to the next level, using data smart to build a case and to learn and to be a learning organization is really important. And the last thing I'll say is collaboration. And we collaborate with ANET in a bunch of our schools. I'm kind of like, oh shucks, I should have mentioned Orchard Garden before he did. As an expanded learning time program, after school program, the data we're getting, we're sharing with the school, and we're getting data from the school. And I think it's these kind of things that are going to be really helpful. I was telling Bill Gates, I was with him one time about what we were doing. He's like, oh my God, there are all these systems. You could share data back and forth. I felt like saying, well, your Gates Foundation isn't helping to facilitate that as much as it could. But it wasn't my fault. But I think, with the convergence of technology, the cloud, the internet, I don't know if you've heard of them, there's a lot of opportunities to use data to build culture, and we need success stories. I mean, and it's these success stories that are going to inspire others and create the future that we want. Do you want me to do interpretive dance on it?
I think the culture, there's a history of kind of a gotcha in terms of data use. Like if you think about the evolution, No Child Left Behind, like major federal legislation to be able to say we're going to shine a spotlight on schools and see how they're doing. That was very eye-opening and had so much good because in a lot of places people weren't even helping children. But the trade-off is like there was an overuse in terms of using data for evaluative purposes and accountability only, and that has played out in so many different places. And so it is a major culture shift within a building when you are saying, you teacher, I'm going to show you exactly how much your students are learning, and we're going to have total transparency around that. And that makes it quite personal. So I completely get why there's been a backlash. In fact, this is one of the reasons why we got started in the first place, to overcome that. So I would say a couple things to get there. Tom, your point around collaboration is so right on. The Henderson, so full inclusion here within Boston, full inclusion school. Many of you may know it. Patricia Lampron is the school leader there. She's been there for just a little bit of time. Their culture over the last year and a half, she said this to me, she goes, it's gone from we teach X to what have our students learned, which is a major shift culturally in terms of the conversation. And she said, what we've been able to do is not have it be I'm doing better than you down the hall, but how collectively can we come together to share what's working, use the data to be able to inform our own practice improvement. Like that kind of deliberate attempt on not using data as a gotcha, but as a growth mechanism for teachers has been incredibly powerful from our experience. And I just think the way you get there is create a safe place. You really name this. You're totally transparent around the culture shift. You know it's going to be difficult, and you're going to go through phases there. But have some small wins, celebrate them along the way, and you can really, affect a tremendous amount of change. But if you go in and just think, I'm going to throw a product at somebody, or I'm going to throw more data at them and expect it to change, actually the opposite effect will happen from my experience.
Can I build on that? Sure. So I'm very familiar with the Henderson School. How many people know? So it's shaped like a donut. It's right near Fields Corner. For years, it was one of the worst schools in the Boston Public Schools. It used to be the O'Hearn School. Bill Henderson was the vice principal at the Hernandez, and he ended up coming to the Henderson when it wasn't Henderson, it was O'Hearn, to be the principal, and he was phenomenal. And we did an apprenticeship there. We got some volunteers to work with some of the students. Now, the school is shaped like a donut, and in the center was a map of the world. And the world was drawn without Asia, because the architect who designed the school in the 50s said, if a rocket shifts above the Earth, it's not going to see the whole Earth, let's forget a continent, and Asia we lose. So in the 90s, when Bill Henderson was there, the school was like a third to half Vietnamese. And he was like, this is crap. You can't teach a school without Asian. So I said to him, look, we could, bring in some volunteers that can help with this. And so we had 3 folks pitch, we're going to save Asia. And 15 students signed up for this. And one kid was in a wheelchair. And they painted the world white, and then did a grid, and did math, and did one of these Peace Corps maps and put Asia back. Now the principal, Bill Henderson, when he first met with the students, he met many times, he put a cane in the door as you went into the center. Because Bill Henderson's blind. Bill Henderson was the person the students had to interact with. And then Bill Henderson was very protective of his teachers. He didn't want this map to be, have like Idaho too big or something, even though he's blind. And it was, I can guarantee you that this project was like 1997, that the students who were on that still remember solving that Asia problem. And I think, we get so caught up in how do we make sure kids do well on math tests. If they're not having fun with math, if you're not seeing how to apply it, it's for naught. And so your question was about culture, you mentioned Henderson. And I just want to say that as we get obsessed with high-stakes testing, the leadership and creativity stuff is being marginalized. And we need to weave that in to help kids reach their potential.
That's great. And Bill, totally, I can see you saying that as well as crap. So let's shift a little bit to students as we think about the role that they play. So we're talking about targeting our underserved populations, and it distances us from the student. And so, Christina, I don't know if you want to share your experience as a teacher or working with schools. What role do you see students playing? So, and how are they part of the solution, part of the creation and construction of their learning experience?
Okay. So far, students haven't been involved as much as they should be. We really love it to be like instead of my teachers teach me this stuff and I'm fed this information, to I am learning this and I have my own voice. So the students don't really know how to feel their way around that. They'll do things like show up to school late every single day and then wonder why they have a D in first period English, and not really make a connection between collecting data even on themselves. We could empower them to take on usage of data in their own lives so that they can do things like speak up and solve problems like the Asia thing, instead of, because they definitely have voice. They love to talk about problems and things they feel are injustices towards them, but being able to analyze and use evidence it's not something that's really taught explicitly in schools. I think we all know how to do that, but where did we learn that from? That's something that just doesn't really go with all the product. And I think I remember the question in the first keynote about going more towards product rather than service, but I think the service is still so important as stuff gets off the ground, and students likewise need that. Instead of just more stuff, they need to know how to use it.
So I think targeting middle school is important. I think there are a lot of great elementary schools in serving underserved populations, but I don't think there are a lot of great middle schools. And as kids make transitions from elementary to middle to high school, and some their K programs, I think that's where a lot of kids get lost. And helping kids really succeed in those transitions, I think, is important. I also think having kids be exposed to college and career success, and often this isn't to kind of say, hey, this is where you could be. It's more giving them motivation to not give up in the here and now. Because a lot of kids, I think, check out of high school mentally in middle school and give kids that kind of exposure. I also think helping kids see the value of working with adults and asking for help and advocating for themselves and having endurance and setting goals. I think these are things our school systems are just not set up to do. And if you give kids a little taste of that, they'll apply those things to other things. And I think of couch potatoes. I don't hear that term much anymore, but I think too often we're not empowering the student to kind of navigate their education career. And if we help them be savvy consumers, how to work with different types of teachers and how to get into the types of classes or the college tracks or what are the extracurricular programs to do, I think it'll help the whole system. And teachers, are burning out. I mean, the millennials, I don't know if we're even on to another generation, but, they're not sticking around at teaching. Part of it is because the students sometimes they're so hard to teach. I think if we help students to be better students, it'll be a win-win and help teachers feel more successful and thrive.
On the student front, I mean, from my experience, the greatest schools in the country that I've come across that are truly helping underserved populations start with high expectations and are really transparent about that with their children. That I don't care what background you come from, what your home life is like. Like, we truly believe that you can go to college and succeed, and we're going to name it and talk about it and expect it. And from my experience, that's so important. And it is also shocking to me how many places I've been to where that isn't the belief within people within the building. And it's intense when you come across that. And so when you're talking about using data, and I mean, that's one of many, but to me it starts with high expectations. It starts with, I read an excellent book that a guy I know, Scott Sider, who talked about, he studied some charter schools here in Boston and about their culture and how they were teaching children things like perseverance and how important that was. Because in all of our experience, we failed in life, and what do you do when you fail? And I think data plays a component of that. It's like, it's, in schools where they're very transparent about where their children are, but, they're setting goals with them. They're celebrating success when children move over time. That can be so powerful when combined with high expectations and a culture that's rewarding students for effort and perseverance. So, these are my big three.
So as we think, as we kind of think forward in the schools that you're working with, or as you're working with going into new areas across the country and pursuing in Quincy, where do you want to see the role of data being used to support student learning? What does that look like 3 years from now, 5 years from now?
Okay, actually, it's a perfect segue to 3 to 5 years from now, because we just started working with City Connects out of BC, and that is a student support initiative. I think adding data to that would make it more powerful and make it become a culture, because our coordinator is going to evaluate every kid in every grade, and they're starting with the middle school, so that kids they don't fall into the cracks, and then we wonder when they're in 12th grade, how come they failed all these tests, how they've just squeaked by with B minuses, and to try to get to that culture of, well, instead of everyone hating everybody, as John Kaplan said, everyone interacting with everybody and being able to use data instead of being afraid of it.
So at Citizen Schools, we're in 8 U.S. states. We're recruiting volunteers. Half of the volunteers we want to be STEM-related, science, technology, engineering, math. A lot of people in those fields don't even know they're in STEM fields. Stem cells, stem of a plant. We believe there's like 12 million STEM professionals. There are a bunch who are also retired. There are a bunch who support those fields. We want to get 1 to 2% to volunteer with kids. So at Citizen Schools, we're trying to find the companies where we can get the pipelines of those volunteers. But we also want to use data for the folks, and we've got like 1,000 Googlers to teach today. We want to get the volunteers to, after they've worked with this population of kids, to use that experience as a credential to raise awareness about these kids and about being part of the solution as opposed to being on the sideline. And we're very focused at running our programs. It takes a lot of work. We have 500 staff. And we talk about this movement building, but we really haven't done it on the scale that I think we can. Charter schools are 2%. We think we could get to 20% of low-income kids through the second shift of educators around the country. And if half of that's STEM related, that could be a game changer in the country being competitive in the STEM fields. So I was just at the White House 2 days ago about this program that we're launching. It still hasn't been fully announced, but we're calling it America 2020. If someone has a better name, feel free to email me. But we're saying we want Fortune 400 companies to commit by year 2020 to have 20% of their workforce, technology workforce, teach 10-week apprenticeships to inner city kids. And we think it'll be transformative both for the kids and for the volunteers. And we're really rallying people around this. And the Obama administration is thrilled. Valerie Jarrett came to our meeting, and apparently that means that it's good. So that's one thing. On the side, and I see Eric's here, I'm part of a team that runs this thing called TEDx Beacon Street, and it's totally free. It's a conference where we had 90 speakers, and we call it Beacon Street because every town in New England has a Beacon Street, so we want to be like the New England Patriots for the TEDx's. But we also want every one of our speakers to offer a time to meet them over the next 12 months on their turf, at their lab, go on a bike ride, in a restaurant, in a kitchen baking something. And so we're taking this online learning and saying, let's make it real and accessible. And what I'm worried about, and I see my kids, I have 3 kids, they're going to do self-directed learning, learn through videos. I'm worried about a lot of kids getting left out in that. And so by creating this laboratory where people can hear talks and meet with the speakers at different times throughout the year that may not work for everyone who can come to these day-long conferences like this one, I think it's a way of democratizing access to this stuff. And it's sort of an experiment, and I welcome any of you to kind of help out. We have a 250-person brain trust and curation leadership, and we want to make learning accessible, hands-on, and community-based. And Boston Regis has been an innovator on so many things, and we think we have an embarrassment of riches here, and we could disrupt the conference model so it's not just in an auditorium, but it's getting out into the community. And we also think people can create media not just from the TED Talks, but from documenting the experiences of going into a jail or swimming in a shark tank or meeting the guy that built the first Segway. So we're coming up with all these kind of adventures, and we're doing something with the top paper airplane guy next month, and after that a surgeon, you can do surgery, not really, but actually kind of do surgery. So.
Is it what do we want to see in 3 to 5 years, or the reality?
Well, ideally that's the statement, but I think where do you see the direction going? I mean, I guess what would your ideal be, and then what are some practical things that, given where the reality is, how do we kind of push that even further?
Okay, all right. One of the reasons I asked that was because, here we're this, fairly small nonprofit. We've got 95 people on our team. We work with 350 schools in 8 cities, so about 100,000 students. And we just came up with this strategic plan through 2017 where we want to impact 250,000 students by that. 250,000 students in this country is still not that much, but it's that hard to make change within schools. And so one of the things that I would like, though, is, when it comes to data use to catch students up that are far behind, it is no longer a mystery around what works. There's studies in the Chicago Consortium study, or Roland Fryer here out of Harvard. There's documentation around how do you effectively use standards and data to catch students up. And so one of the things that in 3 to 5 years that we really want to make happen is to give it away, to tell people, here are the best practices from insights, whether you're not your achievement prep in Washington, D.C., the Henderson we talked about here, the Elliott here, D.C. Prep in Washington, D.C., University Heights in Newark. These are some of the schools in the country that have actually been able to close the achievement gap and show what's possible through standards and data. But so many people in the nation just don't know what those practices are. And so how can we share those and then provide, those right supports for people to use data effectively? Because there's a lot of hoo-ha that gets thrown out to people. And unfortunately, I couldn't get in trouble if Pearson's in the room, but people sell product. product does not change people's behavior and ultimately help students learn more. It's more than that. It's about changing the culture, Melissa, that you talked about, and it's talking about building leader and teacher and district leader capacity around use. So, but there are answers, and I really hope that in 3 to 5 years, everybody knows what those answers are.
Thank you. So we'll open it up for questions.
Actually, one thing I would add on that is I think the game.
What were you doing over there?
Yeah, take a hand around. I think the game is going to change in the next 2 years. How? Big time. No, I just think, well, the 2% in charter schools, there's 2% in virtual schools. You don't hear much about that. And the second people start showing up in school buildings with those dollars, a lot of it's going to change. And I think Khan Academy and all these things that are getting so much traction, people are looking for a silver bullet, and it's not going to be immediate. But I've heard at least 5 references at this conference about how 100 years ago it looked actually the same. I think a year from now, 5 years from now, things are going to look different. And a lot of it is those of us that care about this and are in this, how to read that and how to take advantage of it and also lead and be the sources of inspiration that can change the vector of this.
Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
There's a very huge underserved population here we've not mentioned. A lot of the kids that are incarcerated or in hospitals or who cannot go to a conventional setting. And even though the virtual schools kind of touch on that, do you know of mechanisms or data-related strategies or ways of accessing information about these students and how to help them learn? Since many of them will be coming back into your school districts and expected to assimilate directly into those schools, and are there programs for these kids?
Yes. I was at, I can't remember his name right now, but I was at a conference last year in California at a New Schools Venture Fund conference, and there was a man who spoke, and he spoke entirely about exactly what you're talking about. And he had tremendous outcomes in terms of changing children's lives, and anyway, I will make sure that I get his name and the information, because I can look it up, and then we can post it on the Learn Launch website so you can access it.
I think just on that, I see a sense of urgency to help students make the right choices so they're not incarcerated. So I spend more time in my team thinking about how do we help kids be aware that while that's where a cousin may be, how they can avoid being in that similar situation. This isn't exactly related, but in New Mexico we worked on a Native American reservation, and it was just interesting just to see how some of the cultural norms that we were used to in other settings were so different. And there's someone from Idaho here that I spoke to. She said, "Well, what are you doing for rural kids?" And I think understanding some of the differences, but what's similar is important as we figure out where we put our energies. And then the last thing is, as we work with whole school grades, you're going to get a range of kids. And some may be in foster homes or in situations that may be not too different from this. And how do you teach to all learners so everyone can be successful? And so it's not 1 or 2 kids that are just sucking all the energy of the teachers and the other kids get lost. And I think those are the things that I think we've tried to address. But I think we bring up a good point.
Yeah, so it's a partner once a year. So, in Massachusetts, there are a whole set of collaboratives that are alternative education programs for exactly those kind of kids. And there are dozens of them all over Massachusetts.
How do you access that?
Well, KCOT Collaborative is example one. They're all over southern Massachusetts and the state, and they're all for kids who have failed out of the public school systems and are now channeled into alternative programs. Many of them with criminal convictions, substance abuse, mild forms of mental disorders. There's a wide spectrum there, so that they're there. But I think I'm glad you mentioned it. The reason it's relevant is I think, John, you said, we should all be teaching that their goal should be kind of, college.
Or an option.
Yeah, maybe.
It's a choice for me.
I think that with some of these kids, that kind of long-term distant goal is so distant that it's almost defeating. There's such a different problem they need to address. And many of them may not be going to college. So I think it's in some sense a mistake, I think, to think that college is a kind of a standard thing that's going to be what's going to drive them. I'm not saying it's not, you shouldn't mention it. But it seems to me that for many of them, it's, I want to be a construction worker. What are the kinds of skills I need there? So it's multiple paths. I mean, I think the point is more, let's give them goals that are reasonable goals, not to underestimate what they could do, but that college isn't necessarily a goal or even a gold standard, especially for kids like this.
It's a fine line, though. Only from children who make their own choices. I think what I've learned is never undersell their ability. The moment you do, we have failed them. So you're totally right. People who go on construction, whatever. I just have seen, if you don't have the ultimately high expectations for students, then like they won't meet that bar. But when you set that bar for wherever they want to go, they can reach it. So, but I get your point. I just don't. I have been in schools where, you know, most of the schools we serve, no one has ever been to college before. They never thought about it. They never talked about it. You know, the single-family homes, and it's amazing the transformation that can go on when the adults in the building believe in the children. That's really all my point was, but I totally don't.
I want to kind of bring the thread back to, in a sense, what are the barriers to key shifts? I think that's kind of come and gone in what the three of you have spoken about. And I know the work of the two nonprofits here, and we should all be giving you standing O's because I know what incredible work you've done around the country.
Doesn't mean you're a loser.
No, but I honestly deserves 2 hours standing up. I think Christina, in a way, kicked it off in a negative but important way by noting that 4 teachers, adopted the technology. So I wanted to circle back to John Maycott, what you were saying about creating that safe space to adopt it, because I think that gets at a lot of why, how, and when culture changes. But can you connect the dots with the high-stakes testing environment? And we now have, I think, a very well-intentioned, but I don't know how it's going to unfold, legislation that may connect teacher evaluation to data, right? That was just passed.
Yeah.
And I think it's very well-intended. But how do you create those safe spaces when the real world is actually going to measure in some scary ways on maybe incomplete or limited data?
That is happening now. I think all of Massachusetts has the same kind of teacher evaluation system, and the way our headmasters went about it was in a very safe space way. So instead of trying to throw all of it at us, they just said make one goal for professional practice and one goal on student achievement. And those of us who have grades that are in MCAS years, so for instance, 11th and 12th grade teachers don't have goals around based on the fact that X% of my students scored below X on the MCAS last year, my goal for this year is for them to score blah. And so for them to think kind of incrementally versus oh, it's the end of the world, I have this many who are in needs improvement or warning. That doing that and support, it has to kind of be from the administration down, because if people are left to their own devices to freak out about things, they will. And then if it's thinking about just 2 goals at a time now and then building on, it's better. I was thinking before this about how to, what are barriers to learning how to cook? I have a friend who just hates it and she won't do it, and I thought, well, of course, if I gave her an entire set of chef knives and said, here, make julienne all these carrots and things and make me a stir fry, she wouldn't do it. But I sat down with her and said, this is how you cut up a carrot without cutting off your fingers. Now you try. And then it, this gradual implementation, I think, is the way to go with getting people, or getting that key shift to happen.
I would just add quickly I think there's real tension there. I mean, real tension. And the idea of, holding people accountable for student learning makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot of unintended consequences in terms of rollout and implementation. And I guess what I've seen is at a district or school level, you really have to define clearly, like, what tool or data is used for what purpose, and do not meld purposes. Because, so here's an example. Our organization